1665. After the death of King Philip IV, the Spanish throne passed to his son, Charles II, who, as a result of series of dynastic marriages between the representatives of Habsburg dynasty, was about to rule an enormous empire on which the sun never sets. But as a result of these very consanguineous marriages, in which, in order to preserve territories and influence, the union was concluded between cousins and second cousins, as well as between uncles and nieces, Charles II inherited a whole bunch of genetic diseases that put in doubt his successful reign. The reign of mentally and physically disabled king was characterized by a deep political and economic crisis, which, however, initiated during his father and grandfather's rule. Despite the large inflows of gold and silver from the New World, the Spanish economy was unable to develop, stagnated, for which peasants had to face the decline of living standards, more frequent periods of famine and epidemics, and ultimately the growth of uprisings in the region, and the once mighty Spanish Empire was rapidly fading away. By the end of the 17th century, it became apparent that sick Charles II was barren and unable to conceive an heir to the Spanish throne. At the same time, the King of France, Louis XIV of Bourbon, and the Emperor of Holy Roman Empire, Leopold I, who belonged to the Austrian branch of the Habsburg dynasty, were married to the sisters of Spanish king. Unlike the crown of France and Austria, that of Spain could be inherited through the female line. Therefore, both royal families had the right to declare themselves the legitimate heirs to the Spanish throne. In addition, they were so closely associated with the Spanish crown that both pretenders were cousins of Charles, since their mothers were the sisters of Philip IV. At the same time, the European powers, in particular England and the United Provinces, feared as unification of France and Spain under the rule of one monarch, so the revival of the Spanish-Austrian Habsburg Empire. In this regard, the direct inheritance of the Spanish crown by Louis XIV or Leopold I could lead to an increase of world tension. To avoid this, the King of France expected to receive the crown for his grandson, Philip, Duke of Anjou, and Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, nominated his son, Archduke Charles III of Austria, for the Spanish throne. But there was another candidate, Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria. Born in 1692, the Crown Prince of Bavaria was the grandnephew of Charles II. Since Joseph Ferdinand was neither Bourbon nor Habsburg, the likelihood of Spain merging with France or Austria was small, and therefore his candidacy was most preferred for England and the United Provinces. So Joseph had a good chance of becoming King of Spain and fulfilling his father's ambitious dream of exalting the House of Wittelsbach. Madrid's political instability led to active participation of European countries in the settlement of this issue. These secret agreements on the division of the Spanish monarchy accompanied Charles II almost all his life. 1697, exhausted by a 9-year war, England and France signed the Treaty of Hague that made Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria the heir to the Spanish throne, with the condition that Spain's possessions in Italy and the Netherlands would be divided between Austria and France. This decision was made without the Spain's agreement, which of course was against the division of the empire, and therefore, when signing the Treaty of Hague, Charles II agreed to name the Bavarian prince his successor to an independent and undivided empire, not the parts that were assigned for him by England and France. However, 2 years later, Joseph Ferdinand, the heir of Bavarian throne and the great Spanish Empire, suddenly died of smallpox, and the Spanish succession again became a relevant issue in Europe. The last attempt to resolve the conflict by diplomatic means was made in 1700. England and France ratified the Treaty of London, according to which the Spanish throne passed to the Austrian Archduke Charles, son of Leopold I of Habsburg, while all Italian territories, including Sicily as well as the Basque province, passed to France, and the Habsburgs reserved the right to all other possessions of Great Spanish Empire. However, the Austrians, who did not participate in the signing of the agreement, were extremely angry. They blatantly strived to possess the entire Spanish Empire, and the Italian territories interested them to the utmost, because they were richer and closer to Austria, and therefore they were easier to govern. In addition, the international prestige of Austrian Habsburg and their influence in Europe increased after the victory in the long war with Ottoman Empire and the joining of Hungary and Transylvania to Austria. Even greater indignation was caused by the agreement between England and France in Madrid. The court unanimously opposed the division of empire, but there was no unity whom to support, the Habsburgs or the Bourbons. However, the supporters of the French king were in the majority, and in October 1700, Charles bequeathed all his possessions to the Bourbons, the grandson of Louis XIV, Philip of Anjou. News of Charles II's will threw Louis XIV into a dilemma. Advisors urged that it would be safer to accept the terms to the Treaty of London and not get involved in a difficult war for all Spanish possessions. On the other hand, the French foreign minister noted that a war with Austria would be inevitable, since neither the Treaty of London nor Charles' last will satisfied them. Louis decided to accept the will of the Spanish king, and after his death in November 1700, he proclaimed his grandson, Philip of Anjou, the new king of Spain. As expected, the Austrians immediately began preparing for the war. However, William III of Orange, King of England, was in no hurry to declare war on France, not having the support of his court. But Louis chose too aggressive path to protect French hegemony in Europe and cut off England and Netherlands from trade with Spain, which was a severe blow to the commercial interests of these countries. Dissatisfied with this ban, William III signed the Treaty of Hague with the United Provinces and Austria, according to which Philip V was still recognized as the King of Spain. But Austria received the desired Spanish possessions in Italy and also took control of Spanish Netherlands, thereby becoming the protector of the region from French hegemony. Also, England and Holland again received their commercial rights in Spain. A few days after the signing of the agreement, James II, the previous King of England, who had been removed from the throne by William in 1688, died in France. Although Louis had previously acknowledged William III as King of England, he now declared that the only heir to William III of Orange could be the son of exiled James II, James Francis Edward Stuart. Outraged England and the Dutch Republic, that was angry with the bringing of French troops into the Spanish Netherlands, in response began to assemble an army and joined Austria, whose forces were joined to Prussia and Hanover, and Portugal and Savoy supported France and Spain. The main operational theaters of the upcoming wars in Europe were to become northern Italy, southern Germany, and the Netherlands, and Spain itself. For Spain, which was in deep crisis, the coming war was a real disaster. They were out of money and resources, the government did not have any significant navy or army, so France basically had to defend the vast territories of Spain alone. The war began in summer of 1701, when the Austrian forces, led by Eugene of Savoy, in whom Leopold had the utmost confidence, seeing him as the savior of the country from the recent Turkish threat, invaded the Duchy of Milan, which belonged to Spain. The French army sent by Louis managed to successfully hold back the further attack of the Austrians. Meanwhile, in Netherlands, extensive preparations for war continued. English and Dutch forces were drawn to the borders, whose leadership had to be taken by the magnificent General Marlborough. In Germany, the opposing sides pulled together small troops and stood along the Rhine River. Intending to achieve his goals by diplomatic negotiations, Louis VI ordered in all battlefronts to be strictly limited to defensive actions. In the spring of 1702, England sent a squadron to Portugal and forced King Peter II to terminate the treaty with France. The same year, in October, the Anglo-Dutch fleet broke into Vigo Bay and landed 4,000 troops. A significant part of the Spanish treasure fleet was sunk here, bringing silver and gold from the New World. The Duke of Marlborough led joint forces of the English, Dutch, and German into the northern lands of Spain, where he managed to capture several important fortresses, thereby securing the borders of the United Provinces. On the Rhine, imperial forces succeeded in capturing the fortress Landau, and the threat to invade Alsace diminished after the sudden entry in the war on the French side of Bavaria's elector Maximilian II, whom Louis promised the Spanish Netherlands. The Allies were forced to retreat across the Rhine, where they suffered losses from the attack of the French Empire under the command of the bright and brave Marshal de Villars. In 1703, the Allies' fleet was able to hold off the French Armada at Toulon, and this convinced the Portuguese that the Allies could provide an effective defense against the Bourbons. Therefore, the same year in May, Portugal sides with the Allies. In Italy, at this time, the French began to doubt the loyalty of their ally Victor Amadeus, the Duke of Savoy, and demanded to immediately hand over Turin and Susa to the French and even disband his forces. This, as a result, made him break the alliance with France and join the Allies too. However, this allies' success did not save Austria from the threat looming over it. After all, the French managed to unite with the Bavarian forces, and the Franco-Bavarian army was preparing to attack Vienna. In addition, an unexpected uprising began in Hungary. Hungarians strived for independence from the Habsburg Empire and diverted significant Austrian forces to the east. The French leadership believed that an attack to the center of Austria would force the Habsburgs to renounce their claims to the Spanish throne and would be the beginning of the collapse of their alliance. To eliminate the threat of capture of Vienna, the decisive Duke of Marlborough was about to lead the Anglo-Dutch army south to Germany, where he planned to join the Austrian army of Eugene of Savoy, who started to move from Italy to north. However, the Dutch demanded to leave their troops to protect the borders of their homeland, but Marlborough managed to bring them to sense by stratagem. But despite this, the Franco-Bavarian troops had time to successfully storm Vienna, and brave Villars was aware of this opportunity, but the Elector of Bavaria refused. Instead, he offered to secure the supply of army. A quarrel took place between them, and Villars, one of the most brilliant of the French commanders, was recalled. Marlborough managed to make an incredible march of 400 kilometers in just 5 weeks. With these, Louis ordered his northern army to follow Marlborough south, thereby ending the threat of invasion of the United Provinces. The French did not know Marlborough's plan and thought that he was going to attack them from the south, but Marlborough managed to unite with the Austrian army of Eugene. The joint forces of the Allies now numbered 60,000 soldiers and were twice larger than the Franco-Bavarian forces that threatened to attack Vienna. The Allies' army planned to quickly defeat the Franco-Bavarian army, but the enemy hid behind the walls of Bavaria's cities' fortresses, and without a sufficient number of siege weapons, the Allies could not force them out. In a desperate attempt to lure the enemy out of the fortress, Marlborough orders his troops to begin destroying the villages of Bavaria. But even after 6 weeks, they failed to lure the enemy out. Moreover, the 36,000-strong army of Marshal Thaler arrived in time to help Maximilian. Marlborough lost his numerical advantage, but still decided to fight on August 13, 1704, near the Bavarian village of Blenheim. Thaler believed that his 60,000th army took up good positions in the area of Blenheim, Oberglau, and Lützingen villages. The right flank of the French protected the waters of Danube, and the 56,000 Allies army had to cross the small river Nebel to attack the enemy. Almost half of Taller's army gained a foothold in the Lützingen area and defended the left flank. The second half defended the space between Oberglau and Blenheim. Taller concentrated his infantry and artillery near the villages. According to his plan, the enemy infantry was to be caught in the crossfire of his cannons, then finished off by the blow of infantry and fall under the final onslaught of the cavalry. In theory, the plan was good, but Marlborough was convinced that he could benefit from the strategy of the French marshal. Marlborough believed that if he attacked Blenheim and Oberglau with small forces, he would be able to isolate the enemy forces in the villages and break through the center of the French army with a powerful blow. But in order to implement this plan, it was necessary to keep the French and Bavarian forces in the Lützingen area so that they could not come to rescue the center. This difficult task was assigned to the Austrian forces under the command of Eugene of Savoy. Early in the morning, the Allies moved to attack the French positions. The attacks on Blenheim were so ferocious that the terrified general in command of the flank ordered his reserve battalions into the village. The French, who intended to secure the village from defense, were so crowded in upon one another that they simply did not have enough space to protect themselves effectively. The attack in Oberglau was not that successful. The French counterattacks could break the Allies' forces, thereby causing panic and general retreat. Marlborough pulls additional forces here and asks for help from Eugene, whose forces were literally depleted, holding back forces twice this size. But Eugene responded to the appeal for help by sending Imperial Cuirassier Brigade, and thanks to them, the Allies managed to hold back the French counterattack. Now that the French forces were pinned down in the village, Marlborough ordered the main force to attack the center of the French Empire. The French cavalry tried to hold the center, but having no infantry support, could not hold back the Allies' attack. Tallet in desperation asked his flank to send reinforcements to help, but the Elector of Bavaria refused. Maximilian, seeing the risk of breakthrough in the center, orders his units to retreat. In fact, the battle was over at this point. The besieged troops in Blenheim surrendered, many of whom even never managed to fire. For the first time in almost half a century, the French suffered such a major defeat. Marshal Taller and several of his generals were taken as prisoners. Meanwhile, Marlborough and Eugene saved Vienna from the threat of capture, and this glorious victory was the beginning of their strong friendship. After this defeat, Louis' dreams of absolute dominance in Europe were dispelled. The Laude is getting the new British-born slogan, "No peace without Spain," quickly being picked up in other Allied capitals. The term having become a rallying cry for the refusal to conclude peace with France and the continue of war fights against it. So don't forget to subscribe to not miss the next series, where we'll find out if France and Spain would be able to defend their possessions from a full-scale Allies invasion.